The American Civil War didn't erupt all at once. It built slowly through secession, tension, and a final spark at Fort Sumter. But once that first shot echoed across Charleston Harbor, the nation was pulled into a conflict far larger than anyone expected. Tonight we follow the first year of the war, from the fall of Fort Sumter to the first Battle of Bull Run, and uncover the choices, mistakes, and unlikely heroes that shaped 1861. Why did both sides believe victory would come quickly? And how did a young nation stumble so swiftly into its bloodiest war? Good evening, traveller, and welcome to Realm and Reason. If you'd like to drift through more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe before you fall asleep. Now, take a deep breath in and let it go. Before we begin, let's put your body to rest. Start by resting your attention at the top of your head. Notice the sensations, not just the image of the body, but the feeling of it. Slowly move down through your body, spending about 5 seconds on each part. With every exhale, let that area soften. Imagine your breath traveling through each place you focus on, releasing tension as it flows. Keep moving downward through your eyebrows, your cheeks, your neck and shoulders, your hands and fingers, down through your legs to the very tips of your toes. And now, release the whole body, let yourself drift and rest. Chapter 1. The Stillness. Before the Fire. Winter put a thin shell of quiet over the country, like ice glazing a slow river. The nights drew long. Gas lamps hissed in city streets and threw soft halos onto snow-darkened bricks. A farmer's lantern swung from a mittened hand at the barn door. Somewhere far off, a train called out along the rails and then fell back into the cold. The election had been in November. Abraham Lincoln, a lawyer from Illinois, tall and spare, had won without the votes of the Deep South. He remained at home in Springfield through the winter, writing letters at a desk bright with lamplight, receiving callers, and holding to a quiet schedule that looked simple from the outside. He was not yet the monument people would later make of him. He laughed easily with friends, read late, and measured his words carefully. If he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, he did not show it often. He knew the country was in trouble. He could not know how deep or how long that trouble would run. Early winter's headlines were about South Carolina. On a day in late December, delegates meeting in Charleston signed an ordinance of secession. The word ordinance simply meant a formal act passed by a convention. Its effect was anything but simple. To secede in the language of law is to withdraw from a political union, to step away from the bond that had held states together since the Constitution. Supporters of secession said the Union was a compact among equals, and that any state that had joined freely could depart the same way. Opponents said the Union was older and deeper than that. Not a mere contract, but a national home no one could tear apart without breaking faith. On the coast, Charleston carried itself like a proud stage. The harbour was deep. The tides set their own music. The air smelled of salt and pine smoke. Men in the streets spoke openly of the step their state had taken. Some said it felt like a second independence. Others, even those who agreed with the choice, could not quite still their unease. South Carolina's decision did not remain alone for long. Through January, other Deep South states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana, each by way of a convention that claimed to speak for its people. The votes were not without argument. Not every county agreed, but the broad strokes were clear. The crack that began on the coast ran inland. While conventions voted, local forces moved. The word militia carried weight in those days. A militia was not a standing army. It was a body of citizen soldiers, organized by state authority, who drilled part-time and could be called to serve quickly. In Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana, militia companies, along with hastily organized state troops, seized federal property. That phrase, federal property, meant forts, arsenals, and custom houses, places where the national government kept its strength and collected its revenue. An arsenal was more than a storehouse. It was a guarded complex where arms and ammunition were kept, repaired, and issued. A custom house was the office at a port where import duties were collected, the government's cash register at the water's edge. Taking an arsenal gave a state the tools of force. Taking a custom house gave it money and authority. Taking a fort, brick and granite facing the sea, felt like taking a piece of the nation's face. In Springfield, where the streets were quieter and the winter more deeply lodged in the earth, Lincoln tried to hold to steady habits. He read dispatches from Washington and from friends across the country. He received visitors who wanted him to promise this and refuse that. He chose his cabinet and weighed his words. He walked the short blocks between his home and his office in a black overcoat, the brim of his hat sheltering him from the sting of wind. People who passed him sometimes nodded and sometimes stared. He was a familiar figure, yet he belonged to the whole nation now. When he looked up, he saw snow and the low sky. When he looked down, he saw the boardwalk under his feet. Between those sights stretched the distance to Washington, and a path no one could fully map for him. The country had always been various. That winter it felt like a patchwork pulled too tight. In the northeast and parts of the Midwest, factories built on riverbanks gave off smoke day and night. Looms rattled in brick buildings whose windows steamed in the cold. Rails ran like writing across the land. To many there, modern life meant speed, abundance, and the possibility of a different moral order. In the Deep South, the economy still ran on plantation agriculture. The word plantation described more than acreage. It named a system in which enslaved men, women, and children were claimed as property and made to labor under control. On those plantations, cotton and sugar flowed to market, and wealth flowed back to those who owned. Slavery stood at the center of that world. Some men said they fought for sovereignty, for local rule. Others said plainly that slavery was the cornerstone of their society. In the North, politicians were not all of one mind either. Some hated slavery on principle. Some simply wanted to stop its spread. Some wanted peace at almost any cost. Beneath the arguments lay the human truth. A nation built on the word liberty had entangled itself with human slavery, and the entanglement could not be kept quiet forever. In January, a cold rain misted the south, and the winter sun turned docks and ship masts silver. In those same weeks, the Capitol dome in Washington, unfinished, lifted its iron ribs against a low sky. Congress argued. The outgoing President James Buchanan said he could find no power in the Constitution to force a state to remain. People who listened to him heard caution. Some also heard drift. In boarding houses near the capital, the talk at supper ran hot and then died off as men pushed away their plates. Outside, the muddy avenues lay in rutted darkness. In early February, delegates from the seceded states gathered in Montgomery, Alabama. The town, snug on a bend of the Alabama River, carried itself with a measured pride. Whitewashed fences, broad-porched houses, and long verandas that caught what breeze there was. Inside the meeting hall, men unrolled papers and lifted pens. They were about to make a new government. They called it the Confederate States of America. Confederate in its simplest sense meant allied by agreement. A confederation is a league where the parts hold more power than the center. They drafted a constitution similar to the United States Constitution, but with explicit protections for slavery. It was meant to look familiar and to feel different. Familiar to comfort those who feared chaos. Different to cement the order many wished to preserve. They chose a president. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, a West Point graduate, a veteran of the Mexican War and a former United States Senator, received the call. He had been at home at Briarfield, his plantation near the Mississippi River, when the news reached him. Those who knew him said he was a serious man who carried himself formal and calm, not given to fireworks. He was devoted to Southern independence as he understood it, and careful about how to get there. Around the edges of that stage, symbols began to appear. Flags tell people what to look at and how to feel. In Montgomery, banners with new arrangements of stars and fields fluttered above balconies and marched in parades. The design that came to be called the Stars and Bars would soon be adopted as the first national flag of the Confederacy, and even before formal adoption, variations of it were waved and painted and stitched by hands that wanted a new emblem to love. To people under those colours, the flag promised dignity and self-rule. To those looking up from the other side, it meant a division, clear and aching. Printed words took on a pressure one could almost feel between the fingers. Northern newspapers wondered aloud whether Lincoln would use force to hold federal forts and collect revenue. The phrase "use force" sounded blunt on the page. Southern papers wrote of liberty and destiny. That word liberty did not carry the same freight everywhere. For enslaved people, it meant the most literal thing, freedom from slavery, while the papers that used it in secession, states often meant a state's freedom from federal reach. In the midst of all of this, there were winter mornings that were simply winter mornings. A woman put bread to rise. A teacher cleaned the blackboard and set out slates. A doctor warmed his hands at the stove before making his rounds. A boy walked a frozen fence rail like a gymnast, arms out for balance, and fell, laughing, into the snow. The coexistence of ordinary life and history's pressure is not a contradiction. It is the texture of time. We remember the banners and the speeches, but the banners were stitched in kitchens, and the speeches echoed down streets where people were buying apples and kerosene. By the second week of February, the decision Lincoln had delayed as long as he could no longer waited. He would have to leave Springfield for Washington. The date was set. Friends and neighbors planned to gather at the station. It is one of those moments that, even before it happens, feels like a hinge. A man who has lived a steady, modest life in a familiar town walks to a train, and steps up into a future that will change him and everything around him. At the edge of the platform he paused for a breath. He spoke a few words, simple words about leaving the place where his children were buried and where his life had been made, about undertaking a work he could not do alone. People who heard him later struggled to write it down exactly. What they remembered was not the exact phrasing, but the feeling. A man who understood the size of the task and the smallness of his own strength, and who, with that understanding, climbed the steps anyway. The conductor lifted his hand. The engineer eased the throttle. The couplers knocked once, twice, the way knuckles rap a door in the evening. The train began to move, a first slow pull that made the whole line lean forward into the future. The crowd pressed close, walked along the planks with it for a few steps, and then stood still as the cars slid past. Inside, lamplight flickered in the coach windows. Outside, hands lifted and then fell. As the train cleared the last buildings and found the open track, the prairie spread out under a sky the colour of pewter. Telegraph poles stepped away into the distance, each one a small upright mark on a wide page. The engine found its tempo. The wheels began to sing their repeating song over the rails. Behind the cab, wood stacked in the tender shifted and settled, and the smell of hot iron and smoke braided into the cold air that whipped past the coach doors. Springfield receded. Washington lay ahead, not in miles only, but in the long work of law and war and stubborn hope. Chapter 2. A House Dividing, March 1861. The train that left Springfield carried more than passengers. It carried the last fragile hope that words alone might keep a country whole. Abraham Lincoln's eastward journey began in applause and brass bands and ended in shadows. By the time the rails reached the Potomac, the cheering had thinned into watchfulness. Rumours travelled faster than the locomotive. Somewhere along the route, a telegraph operator tapped out a warning. Talk of a plot in Baltimore to kill the president-elect before he could take the oath. Whether true or invention hardly mattered. Danger felt real. So, near the end of February, Lincoln agreed to a quieter arrival. Before dawn, he slipped into Washington in plain clothes, a soft felt cap in place of his tall hat, a dark cloak drawn close. It was not disguise so much as humility. The way a man lowers his head to pass through a low door. He looked tired, his long frame bent slightly from travel, but his eyes missed little. Washington City, as people then called it, was not the marble capital we imagine. It was half-finished, avenues of mud, boardwalks that tilted at odd angles, gas lamps flickering against the damp. The unfinished dome of the Capitol rose like an iron skeleton above the mist. Soldiers in blue moved quietly through the streets, their presence new enough to draw stares. Some hotels had lost their familiar Southern regulars, but Willard still glowed with activity. Journalists scrawling dispatches, diplomats trading cautious smiles, and politicians arguing until the lamps guttered. In parlours and taverns, the talk circled a single question. Could peace still be saved? A few weeks earlier, men of goodwill had gathered just down the street to try. They called it the Washington Peace Conference, a last attempt to draw compromise from exhaustion. Delegates from 21 states filled the hall with maps and cigars and the weary hope that words might still bridge musket distance. Around the same time, Senator John J. Crittenden of Kentucky, a white-haired statesman who had served the Union for decades, offered his own proposal. It became known as the Crittenden Compromise. He suggested restoring the old Missouri Compromise line, that imaginary boundary drawn decades before at 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude. Slavery would remain legal below the line, forbidden above it. To men like Crittenden, it seemed arithmetic enough to calm tempers, divide the map and end the argument. But arithmetic could no longer solve what was moral at its root. Republicans, newly in power, refused to extend slavery at all. Southern fire-eaters dismissed the offer as too little and far too late. The conference adjourned in disappointment. Its papers gathered dust before Lincoln's train ever reached the city. So Washington waited, uneasy, half convinced that patience might still serve where politics had failed. The outgoing President James Buchanan spent his last days in the White House signing routine documents and avoiding decisions. He maintained, as he had all winter, that the Constitution gave him no power to coerce a state back into the Union. Many took him at his word. Others saw hesitation where action was needed. Lincoln spent those first nights lodged at Willard's, writing notes by lamplight while the city muttered below his window. He was a man who believed in the steady power of reason, that if you laid out the truth clearly enough, decent people would come around to it. But the city outside his window seemed to argue otherwise. The streets were lined with doubt, not logic. Soldiers guarded the bridges, clerks carried pistols to their offices. Even the air smelled divided, half smoke, half wet earth. The inauguration came on the morning of March 4th. A pale sun showed through thin clouds. Troops lined Pennsylvania Avenue from the Willard to the Capitol. Cavalry horses stamped and steamed in the cold. The crowd that gathered on the east portico was smaller than in years past. Many Southern families had already left, yet every face seemed intent measuring the man who stepped forward. Lincoln's black coat brushed the frost from the railing as he took the oath. His voice wavered at first, high and raw in the open air, then steadied. What he said that day was plain but precise. The Union, he told them, was perpetual, not a partnership that any state could simply leave. The Constitution bound them together to form a more perfect union, not to be broken at will. He spoke of law, of patience, of friendship. And then came the line that history would carry. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. He promised not to strike the South, only to defend federal property, the forts, arsenals and custom houses that still flew the national flag. Everyone already knew what those places meant, symbols of the government's endurance and of the Union itself. To Northern listeners, the speech felt like an anchor, measured, merciful, firm. Newspapers praised its tone. The Boston Evening Transcript wrote that the president seeks peace but will not abandon right. But to many Southerners reading the same words in their own gazettes, it sounded like a threat wrapped in civility. The Richmond Enquirer warned, "He speaks of peace while he prepares for war." The same sentences printed on different paper meant opposite things depending on which soil they touched. Cannon salutes boomed from the Navy Yard as the ceremony ended. The reports rolled across the river and echoed faintly through Maryland's bare hills. Some wept at the sound. Others took it as the first thunder of something larger. Far to the south in Montgomery, Alabama, another ceremony had already taken place. In February, the delegates of the seceded states had formed a new government, calling it the Confederate States of America. They had chosen Jefferson Davis as their provisional president. Provisional meaning temporary, to serve until elections could be arranged. When the telegram reached his plantation in Mississippi, offering him the presidency, witnesses said he read it twice, then looked out the window for a long moment before replying, "God help me, for I'm too weak to bear the burden." Yet he accepted. By March, Davis had appointed a cabinet. Robert Toombs of Georgia, fiery and brilliant as Secretary of State, Christopher Memminger of South Carolina at the Treasury, Stephen Mallory of Florida for the Navy, though he had few ships to command, and Judah Benjamin of Louisiana, whose legal mind would soon become indispensable. They set about drafting laws, establishing departments, and sending envoys abroad. It was government built at sprinting pace, ink barely dry before the next sheet was pulled into place. Montgomery basked in early spring sunlight. Bands played on the courthouse square. Women sewed stars onto new flags, one for each seceded state. The design, red and white, with a blue canton of stars in a circle, would soon be known as the Stars and Bars. It was not yet official, but it fluttered everywhere, over the Capitol dome, across balconies stitched into sashes. People spoke of liberty and independence, their voices bright, as if saying the words could make them lasting truth. Still, the celebration carried a shadow. The new nation existed mostly on paper. No foreign government had recognized it, and along the coast several United States forts still stood under the old flag, small islands of federal authority surrounded by Southern guns. Two mattered most: Fort Pickens, guarding Pensacola Bay on Florida's Gulf Coast, and Fort Sumter, standing at the mouth of Charleston Harbor. Each held a tiny garrison, a handful of soldiers maintaining the post. A garrison was more than its men. It was the act of holding, the signal that the government still claimed that ground. Supplies were short, tempers shorter. The forts were ringed by local militia who had not yet fired but had stopped pretending friendship. To the men inside, it felt like living inside the pause between lightning and thunder. In Washington, those forts were the subject of every cabinet meeting. Opinions divided the room. Secretary of State William Seward urged caution, delay, negotiate, buy time. General Winfield Scott, the Army's aging commander, heavy-set now, stooped from years of service but still sharp, offered a soldier's realism. He advised that Fort Sumter should be evacuated. Resupply by sea was impractical, he said, a risk not worth the lives or the symbol if relief failed. Fort Pickens, by contrast, could be held and quietly reinforced, its approach less obstructed, its value strategic. Lincoln listened more than he spoke. To abandon Sumter seemed like surrender. To hold it risked war. Each choice pointed toward ruin by a different road. Beyond those deliberations, the city's mood wavered between vigilance and exhaustion. Senators loyal to the Union walked the marble corridors, aware that some colleagues might be gone by morning. Clerks packed their desks, uncertain which office would still exist next week. The Navy Yard hammered through the night, building and repairing as if the rhythm itself might hold the capital together. At the telegraph offices, Operators worked in short bursts of code, dots and dashes carrying hope and rumour across hundreds of miles of wire. A single line from Charleston could empty the corridors by dawn. Outside, early spring pushed against winter's hold. The Potomac broke its ice into glittering shards that drifted toward the sea. Wagons splashed through the streets. Somewhere near Lafayette Square, a band played a waltz to lift spirits, and a crowd gathered because people will always gather where there is music, even on the edge of war. Meanwhile, in Montgomery, Davis and his advisers studied the same maps that lay open in Washington. Between them stretched not only geography but imagination. Each government saw itself as defensive, the guardian, not the aggressor. To act first was to bear the blame. To wait was to risk humiliation. The telegraph wires between them carried polite words with sharp edges. Will you evacuate the forts? Will you attack? Will you hold? European observers, watching from afar, called it a quarrel among brothers. They could not feel the strain in those wires, the hum of a country waiting for its own heartbeat to falter. In the North, people read that the new president had entered office safely and began to hope again. In the South, people watched the forts on the horizon and wondered how long the silence could last. By the final week of March, the rain turned warm. Magnolia buds opened along Montgomery streets. In Washington, elm trees leafed out pale green above the muddy avenues, their branches hung with the first soft mist of spring. The two capitals, one old, one new, faced each other across the map, their flags bright, their armies still small, their intentions masked by diplomacy. At night, lanterns burned late in both executive mansions. In Washington, Lincoln walked beneath the unfinished dome and felt the echo of his own words, "We must not be enemies." In Montgomery, Davis stood on the veranda and looked north into the distance, as if he might see the other man through sheer force of thought. The air between them was quiet, heavy, listening. Chapter 3. The Guns of Charleston, April 1861. Charleston Harbor in early spring lay bright and restless beneath a shifting sky. The tide drew long glimmers across the flats, and the smell of salt mixed with the sweetness of marsh grass. Out in the middle of that water stood Fort Sumter, an island of brick and granite, shaped like a pentagon and anchored on a man-made shoal. Its walls were 40 feet high in places, pierced with rows of arched gun ports called casemates, vaulted chambers where cannon sat half in shadow, half in the sea's reflected light. At each corner a bastion angled outward to catch the lines of fire that crossed the harbour. The fort was built to guard the coast from enemies abroad. No one had imagined it would someday stand between Americans. Inside, Major Robert Anderson kept a soldier's schedule even as supplies dwindled. He was a Kentuckian, a graduate of West Point, loyal to the Union yet mindful of the South's pride. His command numbered barely 80 men. Artillery regulars and workmen turned soldiers. They rose with the light, drilled and patched what the damp had damaged. They rationed flour and bacon, swept powder dust from the magazines, and took their meals in silence broken only by the slap of waves against the masonry. Letters home went out rarely now. The mail boats had stopped running except under flag of truce. Across the water, Charleston stirred with a different energy. Since January, local forces had seized the other forts in the harbour and ringed Sumter with batteries. lines of guns built from sand, timber, and palmetto logs. Each battery held a handful of cannon, served by volunteers in grey homespun who learned as they loaded, their muzzles pointed inward toward the single fortress that still flew the United States flag. Every tide carried the rumour that Washington would send ships, every dawn that the ships were already coming. In truth, the new administration was still finding its balance. Lincoln, only weeks in office, faced a choice for which there was no safe answer. To withdraw the garrison would look like surrender. To fight for it might ignite the very war he hoped to avoid. He decided on a middle course, provisioning, not reinforcement. The Navy would send food, not powder, to the fort. Bread, coffee, and salt pork would go where cannon shot could not. It was distinction drawn as much in conscience as in law, an act of mercy, not aggression. In Montgomery, President Jefferson Davis received the news with equal frustration. His cabinet argued late into the night. To permit the ships through would admit weakness. To fire first might brand the Confederacy as the aggressor. Honour wrestled with caution until the hours thinned. Finally, they agreed to demand the fort's evacuation. If Anderson refused, they would compel it by force. The decision reached Charleston on April 10th. The city held its breath. That night, Confederate aides crossed the harbour under white flag. Their message was formal and final. The fort must be surrendered. Anderson read the paper carefully by lamplight, his face calm, his voice measured. He would not yield. He would defend his post until he was starved out or relieved. The messengers returned through dark water carrying his answer, and the guns around the harbour waited for morning. At 3:30 on the morning of April 12th, a single mortar shell lifted into the sky from Fort Johnson. It arced high, glowing like a slow comet, and burst over Sumter in white fire. That was the signal. Within seconds, a line of flashes answered from every shore. The first full salvo rolled across the water. Some said the opening gun was fired by Edmund Ruffin, an elderly Virginia secessionist eager for history's notice. Others credited the order to General P.G.T. Beauregard. Whoever touched the lanyard, the effect was the same. After months of talk, the war had begun. Sound behaves strangely over water. Each explosion struck the ear like a physical blow, then came again, softened and delayed, in echo from the opposite bank. Inside Sumter, dust fell from the arches with every impact. Men hauled at tackles, swung cannon on pivots, and shouted through the smoke. The air filled with the mixed smells of burnt powder, wet stone, and salt. A few shells were hot shot. Iron balls heated red in the furnaces of the batteries, meant to set timbers aflame. When they struck, sparks sprayed through the embrasures like bees. The garrison replied as best it could. Anderson had only a handful of heavy guns mounted and the powder to fire them sparingly. Each discharge made the fort tremble from foundation to parapet. The magazine, the underground vault where powder was stored, grew dangerously hot, and barrels had to be moved to cooler chambers by hand. The men worked in shirt sleeves, faces streaked black with soot. Between bombardments, they ate hard bread and salt meat, washing it down with rainwater caught in buckets. There was no fresh bread, no news, no promise of rescue, only the measured rhythm of loading, firing, waiting. On shore, Charleston's rooftops filled with spectators. Families watched through spyglasses as if it were a fireworks display. Ladies in silk gowns leaned from balconies. Children clapped at the flashes. The spectacle lasted hour after hour through daylight and into night, the sky stained with the colour of flame. On the second morning, Sumter's flag still flew, though its staff had been shot away. Anderson's men raised it again on a makeshift pole lashed from spars. By noon of April 13th, the fort's interior was burning. The wooden barracks caught first, then the officers' quarters. Black smoke poured through the embrasures and blew seaward. The men kept to the lower levels, fighting heat as much as the guns outside. At last, seeing no purpose in further resistance, Anderson agreed to surrender on honourable terms. His men would evacuate, salute their flag, and depart under truce. Not a single defender had been killed in combat. Only one man died later, when a stray spark touched off powder during the farewell salute. 34 hours of battle, and the first casualty of the Civil War was an accident. The Confederate guns fell silent. From Charleston came the roar of celebration, church bells, cheers, brass bands marching through the streets. From the sea came the silence of disbelief. The telegraph carried the news northward in a handful of words. Fort Sumter has fallen. In the cities of the North, men stopped in the streets to read the bulletins. Women wept or prayed. The long argument over Union and Secession had become a fact of smoke and stone. Lincoln received the report on April 14th. For a long moment he said nothing. The decision he had postponed through months of patience had now been made for him. The next morning he issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteers to suppress combinations too powerful to be suppressed by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. The phrase was legal, almost dry, its effect electric. Across the North, drums sounded on courthouse greens. Young men lined up before recruiting tables, some in uniform from the old militias, some in plain work clothes. The word militia carried its old meaning again. Citizens temporarily called to serve under state authority, each bringing his own courage and uncertainty. The call struck the Upper South like a shockwave. Virginia, which had hesitated, now moved to join the Confederacy. Its convention voted for secession on April 17th, and Richmond, with its foundries and rail lines, soon replaced Montgomery as the Confederate capital, a transition made formal on May 29, 1861, when the government officially moved there. Within weeks, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina followed, unwilling to send troops against their neighbouring states. The Union had cracked open along fresh lines, wider than any imagined when the first gun fired. Meanwhile, Lincoln turned his attention to the coast. If the rebellion could not be stopped at once, it might at least be contained. On April 19th, he declared a blockade of every southern port from South Carolina through Texas, a ring of ships to choke off trade and foreign aid. A blockade, in naval language, meant more than presence. It was a cordon recognized by law, a barrier that turned harbours into traps. 8 days later, on April 27th, he issued a second proclamation, extending the blockade to Virginia and North Carolina, which had since joined the Confederacy. The idea was simple in outline and vast in scope. Starve the Confederacy of Commerce until its will or means collapsed. Later critics would nickname it the Anaconda Plan, imagining the Union Navy as a great serpent coiling slowly around its prey. Up in the shipyards of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, the order transformed silence into clamour. Steam whistles shrieked. Saws bit into oaken pine. Hammers rang against iron hulls. Smoke rolled from stacks as old merchantmen were refitted for war. Sailors signed papers at pay desks they had never seen before. Shipwrights spoke of contracts that would outlast them. The industrial North, so long accused of softness, began to harden. In the South, the reaction mixed triumph and apprehension. Crowds in Charleston paraded beneath banners, but the wiser heads understood what a blockade meant. Cotton might be king, yet kings can be isolated. The ports on which the Confederacy depended, New Orleans, Mobile, Savannah, Wilmington, now faced the prospect of empty horizons and foreign silence. The war that had begun with cannon and smoke would soon spread to hunger and deprivation. Back in Washington, the city moved with new purpose. The same avenues that had seemed half asleep in March now filled with wagons, uniforms, and hurried orders. The Capitol dome still stood unfinished, its ribs of iron open to the sky, but the sound beneath them had changed from echo to industry. Clerks sorted enlistment rolls. Foundries forged new artillery. Telegraph wires hummed with directives, no longer rumours. The nation was awake. In Charleston, Fort Sumter still smoked days after the surrender. The tide carried fragments of timber and powder barrels out to sea. Seagulls circled above the shattered walls, crying through the haze. A few soldiers walked the parapets, staring at what they had done. The flag that had fallen would rise again elsewhere, and the harbour that had once been a place of trade would now be remembered as the cradle of war. Chapter 4. A Nation. Arms. Itself. May-June 1861. In the spring of 1861, the sound of war spread not through cannon but through hammers, drums, and footsteps. In the north, city squares and courthouse lawns filled with motion. Posters flapped on walls, bright with ink and exclamation points. "To arms! Defend the Union!" Boys from workshops and farms crowded before the recruiting tables, their names taken down in ledgers by clerks whose hands shook from the pace. Bands played marches that everyone half remembered from parades. The war was still an idea, and an idea is easy to cheer. Everywhere a sense of volunteering carried the moment. The country had no vast standing army. What it had were towns and neighbourhoods ready to offer themselves. A regiment, that word suddenly common on every tongue, meant roughly 1,000 men gathered from the same region, divided into 10 companies. When a new regiment was mustered, it had been officially counted and accepted into service, its officers sworn in, its men recognised as soldiers rather than hopefuls. Muster rolls were read aloud on courthouse steps while mothers and wives listened at the edges of the crowd, trying to fix each name in memory. The excitement spilled outward from the squares. Churches hosted sewing circles that turned pews into work tables. Women stitched shirts, bandages, and flags until the wax from candles slicked the cloth. Merchants donated barrels of flour and sugar to local depots. A bank in New York began offering one of the first war loans, a subscription in which citizens and private groups lent money to support state defense, until federal bonds were authorized later that summer. In farmhouses, families set aside a corner of the pantry for goods to send to the front once their sons were gone. The post offices grew noisy with new mail bags and volunteer couriers. Paper became the country's new lifeline. At first, the organization was as improvised as the enthusiasm. A blacksmith might find himself elected captain because he owned a horse. A lawyer might be handed a colonel's sash because he knew how to speak. Volunteers drilled in public parks and open fields, their lines uneven, their commands uncertain. Drill was the army's name for practice, marching, turning, loading, and firing, until every movement could be done on instinct. It was repetition made holy, the art of turning confusion into coordination. Farmers who had never marched farther than a fence line learned to wheel and pivot as one. Some learned the language of cadence, mark time, but the right flank, as though memorizing a foreign hymn. Factories joined the noise. In Lowell and Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, textile mills turned from shirts and work coats to uniforms. Blue dye ran in the rivers. Blue dye ran in the rivers. Seamstresses stitched until their fingers bled. Tailors worked by lamplight, cutting bolt after bolt of cloth into the pattern of a soldier's coat. Trains stood waiting to carry regiments east or south. The word logistics was not yet common, but the work it described was everywhere. Rails groaning with freight, depots stacked with barrels of flour and kegs of powder, wagons creaking under crates of boots and hardtack biscuits packed to last through rain and heat alike. Training camps rose almost overnight. On the outskirts of Harrisburg stood Camp Curtin, a vast patchwork of tents and mud, the largest camp in the north. In Ohio, Camp Dennison filled the valley with smoke from cook fires and the echo of bugles calling untested men to assembly. The days began before sunrise. By noon the air shimmered with heat, and by evening it smelled of sweat, pipe smoke, and boiling coffee. The word greenhorn, meaning untried, floated through the ranks as both insult and badge. Here, in these fields, civilians turned themselves into something harder. If the North armed itself with speed, the South did so with conviction. In towns from Virginia to Texas, state militias, those citizen armies that had long drilled a few weekends each year, became the backbone of the new Confederate forces. The militia had once meant nothing more than neighbours gathered under state authority, a civic habit rather than a profession. Now they were soldiers in earnest, their drill fields measured by urgency. Some came wearing pieces of the old United States uniforms, blue coats hastily turned inside out or dyed grey. Others arrived in homespun, each company distinct in cut and colour. A visitor could tell a man's county by his buttons. Horses were sold to form cavalry units, and churchyards echoed with the calls of bugles learning new notes. Arming these volunteers proved harder than enlisting them. Muskets were scarce. Some companies drilled with broom handles or pikes until proper weapons could be found. Cannon had to be cast anew. Powder mills worked day and night, their workers moving carefully in the fearsome quiet of places where a single spark could undo everything. Shoes were worse than gold. In some rural regiments, men marched barefoot until donations or captured stores filled the gap. Yet spirits held. Pride in the first months of a war needs little feeding. In towns like New Orleans and Savannah, the first shock of isolation began to show. The blockade had turned harbours into still ponds. Dock workers leaned on railings and watched the anchored ships collect dust and gulls. The smell of tar and salt mixed with heat until it felt heavy enough to breathe. Cotton bales towered along the quays, a white wall that no one could move. Merchants counted losses quietly and spoke of running the blockade with swift, low-built ships that might slip through at night. A few tried, lights doused, engines muffled, trusting the tide more than luck. Blockade running would become an art before the summer was done. In late May, the Confederacy moved its capital northward from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia. The change was more than administrative. It was symbolic defiance. Richmond stood less than 100 miles from Washington, its foundries already turning out cannon and shot, its railroads radiating into every southern state. To plant the new government, there was to place the seat of rebellion almost within sight of the Union's own Capitol dome. Crowds greeted the arriving officials with cheers and bunting, and on May 29, 1861, the Capitol formally opened in its new home. The city's air filled with the hammering of armourers and the murmur of clerks setting up offices, a frontier between two worlds of government now facing one another across the Potomac. By summer, the blockade declared in April had begun to tighten its grip. Warships cruised the coast from Virginia to Texas, their sails and smokestacks marking a barrier that slowly closed the South's harbours. Merchant ships returning from Europe found anchorages empty and customs houses silent. Cotton bales stacked on docks waited for buyers who would never come. The rhythm of southern trade faltered, and with it, the confidence that cotton alone could rule the world. Factories and shipyards in the north responded with a new kind of fever. Ironworks in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia poured molten metal into molds shaped for cannon barrels. Shipwrights hammered hulls until their hands blistered. In Brooklyn's Navy Yard, the keel of a new warship slid down greased timbers into the East River to cheers. The hum of saws and steam joined the telegraph's click, a sound that now bound every state to Washington in pulses of electricity. Commands could cross 100 miles faster than a horse could saddle. The modern age had come to war. In the border states, uncertainty ruled. These were the places where loyalty bent like a branch in the wind. In Kentucky, the legislature declared neutrality, insisting that neither Union nor Confederacy should claim its soil. But neutrality is a fragile peace. Both sides courted the state, and both sent agents to watch its borders. In Maryland, tempers ran hot enough that Washington feared rebellion within sight of the Capitol dome. Federal troops occupied rail lines to keep the city connected, and arrests came quietly in the night. The president suspended the writ of habeas corpus, the rule that required a judge to approve a citizen's detention, a controversial act meant to keep the Capitol safe, but one that set uneasy precedent. Missouri proved rougher ground still. Its rivers and prairies became a tangle of rival commands, Union Home Guards and secessionist State Guards, skirmishing along county lines, each convinced it fought for the true Missouri. On May 10th, the Camp Jackson affair erupted in St. Louis when federal troops surrounded a pro-Confederate militia camp. Shots were fired. Civilians fell in the crossfire. The city's streets ran with panic and fury, and the conflict only deepened. Even families divided, brothers drilling under opposite flags. Out on the prairies and in the mountain valleys, the war's first small battles flickered into being. They were hardly more than sharp encounters, brief, chaotic and often misreported, but they carried weight far beyond their size. On June 3rd in Western Virginia, Union forces under Benjamin Kelly surprised a Confederate camp at Philippi. The fight lasted less than 20 minutes, a handful of wounded on each side, yet newspapers hailed it as a victory and called it the Philippi Races, mocking the speed with which the defenders fled. Rain had fallen that morning. The smell of wet earth and powder mingled in the valley. Women came out afterward with kettles of coffee for the wounded. The hills of what would soon become West Virginia echoed with new pride. The Union flag flew again over a contested land. 2 days later, on June 5th, came the engagement at Pig Point, where Union gunboats testing the Chesapeake's defences traded fire with Confederate shore batteries. The exchange damaged little but nerves. It was one of the first instances of naval combat in the war, a prelude to what the blockade would demand. Farther west, on June 17th, Union troops clashed with state guards at Boonville, Missouri. There, too, the fight was brief but decisive. The Union held the Missouri River, securing a corridor that would matter deeply in the years ahead. To those present, the skirmishes seemed local. To the watching nation, they were proof that the war had already spread beyond Charleston, touching forests, plains, and coasts alike. While men fought and drilled, the machinery of war grew behind them. Armories once idle now rang with hammers. Rail lines became arteries pulsing with troop trains and freight cars. Supply depots sprawled across open ground, piles of crates marked in paint. Ammunition, medical stores, rations. In the cities, smoke hung over the rooftops, and the clang of foundries joined the noise of marching feet. The scale of the thing was beginning to reveal itself. The United States had gone to war before, but never against itself, never on ground so wide or with stakes so personal. Camp life filled with its own stories. In Virginia and Maryland alike, green recruits slept on straw or bare ground. The first outbreaks of measles and dysentery spread through the tents, felling more men than bullets ever had. Mess cooks experimented with rations of salt pork and beans, inventing dishes that would follow soldiers for years. When the sun went down, fiddles came out, and songs drifted over the camp lines, ballads of home, hymns of courage, and sometimes silence where homesickness was too strong to sing through. Doctors wrote for quinine, quartermasters begged for shoes, and still the trains came, carrying more volunteers than the camps could hold. By June's end, the first heat of summer settled on both armies. In camps from the Potomac to the Mississippi, tents shimmered in the haze. The enthusiasm that had filled enlistment halls began to meet the realities of hunger, blisters, and drill. Men who had never marched farther than a ploughed field learned the feel of miles underfoot. Powder smoke clung to their clothes, and the taste of salt pork became a memory they could not escape. Letters home spoke of pride, boredom, and the shock of understanding that this would not be over by harvest. In Richmond, government clerks unpacked files into offices still smelling of fresh paint. In Washington, new regiments arrived daily, crowding the streets with uniforms that did not yet match. The two capitals faced each other across the map like mirrors, each confident, each fearful, each certain the other would break first. Between them stretched rail lines, rivers, and the growing hum of preparation. By the close of June, the war had become a fact of daily life. Fields turned from green to dust under the weight of boots. Town bells that once rang for weddings now marked departures. Hospitals began to fill with the first wounded of the small engagements. Men bandaged in torn sheets, surgeons working with hands raw from soap and alcohol scrubbing. The armies were not yet vast, the battles not yet great, but the nation had armed itself, and the rhythm of peace was gone. Summer had come, heavy with promise and dread, and both sides, at last, understood that what had begun in Charleston's Harbor would not end quickly, nor end the same world that had known the spring. Chapter 5. Baptism by Fire, July-August 1861. The summer of 1861 opened with banners, speeches, and the conviction that the whole business might soon be settled. From New York to Chicago, newspapers printed maps of Virginia as if the countryside were a game board. Columns marched through city streets beneath bunting and cheers. The phrase, "On to Richmond," appeared in headlines, in songs, even in shop windows. People spoke it like a promise that a single victory, one grand march south, would restore the Union and end the rebellion before autumn. The enthusiasm was genuine, but it carried the scent of inexperience. Few yet understood what a campaign really meant. In military terms, a campaign was not one battle, but a sequence of operations, weeks or months of marching, fighting, waiting, and marching again. But that summer, the public imagined something simpler, an expedition, a parade that might return home in time for harvest. In Washington, the capital had changed since Lincoln's arrival. Tents ringed the city like a second wall. Drill fields stretched from the Potomac to the hills beyond Georgetown. The men who filled them were mostly volunteers, farmers, laborers, students, clerks, proud to serve but still learning the rhythm of soldiering. Their blue coats were new enough to shine in the sun. When they shouldered their muskets, the air smelled of fresh oil and linen rather than powder and sweat. The Army's commander, Brigadier General Irvin McDowell, was an officer of quiet bearing and careful thought. He knew his troops were green and said so openly, but public pressure swelled around him. Congressmen visited the camps demanding action. Newspapers accused him of delay. "You are moving too slow," one editor wrote, "while treason grows bold." McDowell argued that his men needed more drill, more discipline. The answer came back, "The country will not wait." So plans took shape. Not perfect plans, but plans enough to move. Across the Potomac, the Confederate Army under General P.G.T. Beauregard camped along a small stream called Bull Run near the town of Manassas Junction, where two rail lines met like crossed swords. That junction gave the South an advantage. Reinforcements could arrive from the Shenandoah Valley by train, a modern trick of movement still new to war. Confederate soldiers built earthworks along the ridges, stacking fence rails and cutting brush for cover. They called themselves the Army of the Potomac, too, unaware that the name would soon belong to their northern enemy. By mid-July, the temperature climbed above 90 degrees. The air shimmered over the fields, thick with the scent of clover and dust. On the morning of July 16th, McDowell's army, nearly 35,000 strong, crossed the Potomac to the rolling farmland of northern Virginia. Wagons groaned under barrels of hardtack biscuits and salted meat. Cannon wheels left deep grooves in the red clay roads. The columns stretched for miles, blue banners rippling under a sun already fierce enough to make men faint. For many, it was their first true march. Boots blistered, canteens ran dry. When they halted near Centerville 3 days later, some men dropped to sleep in the shade without unslinging their muskets. McDowell's plan was straightforward: feint along the Confederate right and strike their left, turning Beauregard's line and cutting the railroad. It was sound in theory, complicated in practice, and utterly new to most of the men who would carry it out. As the Union Army gathered, civilians followed. The road from Washington filled with carriages, wagons, even picnickers. Lawmakers and journalists wanted to see the triumph they had predicted. Ladies in summer dresses packed baskets of fruit and wine. Some brought opera glasses. Boys clung to wagon tails. They believed they were going to witness history, and they were, though not the kind they imagined. On the evening of July 20th, both armies bivouacked within sight of each other's campfires. The land around Bull Run was a patchwork of farms, rail fences, meadows, small groves, and the occasional ridge that rose just high enough to command a view. The stream itself wound through tangled brush, shallow but muddy, its banks steep in places. Soldiers drank from it, filled canteens, and cursed the taste of clay. A few miles north lay the Sudley Ford, where a narrow road crossed the water. That was McDowell's chosen point of attack. At dawn on Sunday, July 21st, the Union Army moved. The sun rose red through the haze, and a thin mist hung over the fields. Artillery rumbled forward, 6-pounder field guns, 12-pounder howitzers, 10-pounder rifled guns, and a few of the new 12-pounder Napoleons, all drawn by teams of horses, the drivers shouting over the creak of harness leather. Skirmishers stepped through waist-high grass, muskets held low. When the first Union batteries opened fire, the sound rolled like thunder, shaking dust from the rafters of farmhouses miles away. On the far side of the stream, Confederate guns answered, white smoke drifting between the trees. The Battle of Bull Run, or Manassas as the South would name it, had begun. The fight soon dissolved into confusion. The smoke thickened, hiding hills and fences. Orders went astray. Regiments fired at shadows. Horses screamed. The air tasted of sulphur and heat. Civilians who had climbed the ridges to watch found themselves staring into chaos. One congressman later wrote that he had expected to see orderly lines and gallant charges. Instead, he saw dust, noise, and men running in both directions. The illusion of tidy heroism broke before the morning was half gone. On the Confederate left, a Virginia brigade under a quiet professor-turned-officer held firm on a rise called Henry House Hill. Its commander, Thomas Jonathan Jackson, stood with one arm raised as shells burst nearby. Another officer, traditionally identified as Brigadier General Barnard B., trying to rally his men, pointed to the ridge and shouted, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall." The name stuck, and with it a legend, Stonewall Jackson, the calm centre of a storm. Under his command, the line held long enough for reinforcements from the Shenandoah Valley to arrive. Men brought by train under General Joseph E. Johnston. It was one of the first times railroads changed the course of a battle. By mid-afternoon, the Union advance faltered. Units that had marched out with flags waving now staggered back through the fields, their ranks broken. The heat was merciless. Canteens lay empty, throats raw with powder smoke. McDowell tried to rally his men, but rumor spread faster than orders. Someone shouted that Confederate cavalry were charging the rear. Panic caught like fire in dry grass. Wagons jammed the roads toward Centerville. Horses reared and the retreat became a rout. Civilians fled with the soldiers, abandoning carriages in the mud. The same hills that had hosted picnics that morning were littered by nightfall with overturned baskets, broken bottles, and the wounded crying for water. For the first time, the North saw its army in retreat. The road to Washington filled with dust and silence, broken only by the sound of exhausted feet. Soldiers who had marched out singing now walked with their heads down, rifles dragging. Many threw away packs and blankets to lighten their load. Some collapsed beside the road, too weary to go on. When they reached the Potomac, they crossed back over in silence, the dream of a quick victory left behind on the Virginia hills. The South meanwhile rejoiced. In Richmond, church bells rang and crowds poured into the streets. Jefferson Davis himself rode to the battlefield on the evening of July 21st, hoping the victory might open a path toward peace on Southern terms. Yet even in triumph, there was unease. The Confederates were too disorganized to pursue. Their own units were scattered and exhausted. They had won the field but not the war. Both sides learned a grim and new vocabulary. The word casualty, once abstract, became a count of names, men killed, wounded, or missing. The numbers from Bull Run staggered the public, roughly 4,800 casualties in all, of whom about 800 lay dead. Each figure represented a body. A letter returned unopened. A home darkened. The scale was small compared with what was to come, but it was vast enough to shock two nations that had never imagined such cost. In the camps that night, the wounded moaned under canvas. Surgeons worked by lantern light, their sleeves rolled past the elbow, their tools rinsed in water or wiped clean with the rags. They used whatever they had: soap, whiskey, and steady hands. The smell of iron and sweat hung heavy in the air. A few women from nearby farms came with buckets of water, their faces pale in the flickering light. Outside, the field still smoked from fires set by bursting shells. In Washington, news of the defeat spread faster than truth. Rumors claimed the army had been destroyed, the capital under threat. Crowds gathered before the War Department demanding answers. Lincoln listened in silence as the reports came in. His shoulders seemed to bend under the weight of each telegram. He said little, only that the men had done their best with what they knew. The illusion was gone. The war would be long. 3 days later, on July 26, he appointed a new commander, George Brinton McClellan, a 34-year-old general from Ohio who had served with distinction in the Mexican War and recently won small victories in Western Virginia. McClellan was precise, ambitious, and skilled in organization. The newspapers called him the young Napoleon. Lincoln hoped that discipline and method would replace the chaos of Bull Run. The army he gave McClellan would soon take the same name as its enemy had once claimed, the Army of the Potomac, and it would become the largest fighting force the continent had ever seen. For now, though, the capital held its breath. The Potomac shimmered in the heat. Regiments that had fled were reformed and re-equipped. Along the river banks, engineers dug fortifications that would ring Washington with earth and cannon. The city that had once lived on speeches and pageantry now learned the sound of spades in dirt. Across the south, towns buried their dead and polished their pride. The war had baptized both sides in fire, and the innocence of spring was gone. When the sun set over the empty fields of Bull Run, the grass glowed red, where the light caught spent cartridges. The air was still, broken only by the slow buzz of insects and the clatter of a distant wagon wheel. What had begun as a nation's confidence ended as its first lesson. Victory would not come by spectacle or by speech. It would come, if at all, through endurance, and the long road had only just begun. Chapter 6. A War Takes Shape. September to December 1861. By early autumn of 1861, the heat and dust of summer had settled into something slower, heavier, and more sober. The country that had marched out in July with picnic baskets and bright banners now moved with a different cadence. Days shortened, shadows lengthened, and the first hints of cold brushed the ridgelines of Virginia. The war was no longer a rumour or an argument. It was a landscape people lived inside, a shape that deepened with each passing week. In Washington, the camps surrounding the capital grew into a small city of their own. Rows of white canvas tents stretched across fields that had once held grazing cattle. The smell of wood smoke and boiled coffee hung in the morning air. Soldiers rose before the sun, rubbing sleep from their eyes as bugles called them into formation. When they stepped outside, their breath fogged faintly in the cool air. The ground, beaten flat by thousands of boots, had become a kind of packed clay stage on which the next chapter of the war was beginning to rehearse itself. At the centre of this new order stood Major General George Brinton McClellan, the young officer Lincoln had appointed just after Bull Run. McClellan carried himself with an air of precision, upright posture, clipped moustache, eyes that measured everything. He had graduated near the top of his class at West Point, served in Mexico, and studied European armies with the care of a man reading a map to the future. When he rode through camp on his dark bay horse, the men straightened instinctively. They called him Little Mac among themselves, half affectionate and half awed, though the newspapers preferred a grander name, the Young Napoleon. Not because he waged battle, but because he seemed born to organize one. His task was immense. The wreckage of Bull Run lay behind them. The promise of something stronger had to be built ahead. So he set about transforming volunteers into soldiers. The Army of the Potomac, that was the formal name now, became a world unto itself. Regiments learned to march not in loose crowds, but in perfect alignment, one boot rising just as the one beside it fell. Officers studied maps and practiced issuing orders clearly enough to be heard in the din of a field. Quartermasters learned how to manage endless lists, blankets, tents, boots, cartridges, and the daily bread that kept an army from collapsing under its own hunger. A few terms entered the soldiers' daily language. One was entrenchment. It meant digging, long hours of it, carving ditches and mounding earth into walls that could blunt artillery fire. Another was picket line, the thin veil of sentries posted beyond camp, their job to watch for movement in the dark. Soldiers picked up these terms the way they picked up habits. From each other, from the older hands, from the low murmur of the drill fields. The war had begun teaching them its grammar. McClellan believed deeply in preparation. He walked the lines at dawn, watched drills for hours, and wrote long letters to the War Department outlining what the army needed: rifles, wagons, better saddles, more cavalry. He inspected bridges, surveyed roads, and ordered new fortifications to ring Washington like a chain of quiet guardians. Engineers expanded the work steadily, and by winter a rapidly growing ring of forts, earthworks, and gun batteries began to encircle Washington, a new defensive landscape rising almost overnight from the fields and forests around the capital. His emphasis on readiness only intensified after November 1st, when Lincoln elevated him to General-in-Chief, giving him responsibility for both the army he drilled each day and the overall conduct of the war. He strengthened morale too, visiting tents, chatting with the men, giving them a sense that someone above them understood exactly what they faced. In those months, he became the most trusted figure in the Union Army. But for all his energy, he held the army back from battle. He looked at maps and saw enemy strength everywhere. He asked for more troops, more guns, more certainty. To the men in the ranks, this felt like wisdom. To Lincoln, it felt like delay. Yet September drifted into October, and the Confederate army remained just across the river, formidable, silent, and watchful. In Richmond, the new Confederate capital, the mood had changed as well. The city, chosen back in May, pulsed with newfound urgency. Government offices had filled every available building. Freight wagons clattered through the streets carrying uniforms, harness leather, sacks of flour, and crates of ammunition. The Tredegar Iron Works, the largest foundry in the South, poured molten metal day and night, shaping cannon, shot, and iron rails that glowed like captured fire. The air smelled of smoke and hot iron, and sparks rose from the furnaces like fireflies escaping into dusk. The capital's location spoke a message of its own. Richmond stood close enough to Washington to feel the tremor of every movement on the Union side. Each army could almost sense the presence of the other, the way two storms sense the heat between them before lightning joins the sky. Though Confederate forward posts along the Potomac had withdrawn in September, their main defensive line still rested at Centreville and Manassas through the winter, only a march away in distance and imagination. Yet differences between the two nations were beginning to show. In the North, factories adapted quickly. Textile mills in New England wove blue cloth for uniforms, and shoe factories in New York and Pennsylvania refitted their machinery to stamp out brogans by the tens of thousands. Foundries forged and finished rifle barrels and parts, shaping the metal into what soldiers would carry through the fields to come. Railroads became pulsing arteries of iron, carrying raw materials to depots and hauling finished goods out again. Telegraph lines hummed along the tracks, carrying short, urgent bursts of code, instructions, supply orders, troop movements. In the South, industry worked bravely but faced limits from the start. The blockade, which had been little more than a line drawn on paper in April, now tightened month by month. In northern ports, new vessels slipped into the water, some with broad paddle wheels, some with screw-driven propellers, and steamed toward their assigned stations along the coast. The blockade was not seamless yet. but it was becoming a stubborn barrier. Ship captains returning from Europe found themselves shadowed by Union vessels the moment they neared Confederate waters. Cotton prices swung wildly, imported goods grew scarce, inflation crept like vines along the edges of daily life. Women in cities began saving scraps of cloth. Merchants counted their inventory with a frown. Coffee became a luxury. Salt, crucial for preserving meat, rose sharply in price before Thanksgiving, a hardship that would deepen into true scarcity as the war wore on. Meanwhile, both armies felt the same pressing need: how to care for the wounded and sick. Through the summer, field medical care had been improvised. Tables in barns, blankets on floors, surgeons hunched over in lamplight. But by autumn, something more organised began to emerge. The US Sanitary Commission, founded back in June, expanded its work until its presence was felt across every major camp in the Union armies. Its mission, simply put, was to keep soldiers alive. Volunteers inspected camps for cleanliness, advised officers on waste disposal, and distributed blankets, shirts, bandages, and fresh vegetables. They advocated for clean water and better shelter, ideas so ordinary today that their importance is easy to overlook, but at the time they were revolutionary. Women stepped forward in ways few had expected. Dorothea Dix, known for her work reforming mental health care, took on the formidable task of organising nurses for the Union Army. She insisted they be over 30 and plain in appearance, a rule the soldiers sometimes mocked gently but respected in practice. Her nurses brought order into chaotic tents, washing clothes, scrubbing floors, and sitting at the bedsides of boys who had never before been away from home. Another figure began her quiet rise that autumn. Clara Barton, a clerk from the patent office, who gathered supplies by hand and delivered them directly to the camps. She listened closely to what the soldiers lacked, then filled crates with socks, mittens, apples, and whatever comfort she could gather from the generosity of neighbours. No one yet imagined the role she would come to play, but the soldiers she helped remembered her presence, calm, steady, unafraid. Confederate medical care followed its own improvised path. Churches, warehouses, and public halls became hospitals. Women formed aid societies that knitted socks, stitched uniforms, and prepared food for the wounded. They met in parlours with lamps burning low, passing baskets of cloth down the line and whispering prayers over each finished roll of bandages. In towns, boys too young to enlist carried buckets of water to the makeshift hospitals, their faces pale but determined. As nights grew colder, the shape of daily life in both armies shifted again. Winter quarters, the term soldiers used, meant building long rows of huts or cabins to survive the cold months. In the Union camps, men felled trees, sawed boards, and laid out walls of rough logs. Each hut held a small stove, a chimney of mud-daubed stone, and bunks that smelled faintly of pine. Soldiers scavenged nails, hammered planks, and hung blankets across the doorways to keep out the wind. They named their makeshift streets with a mix of homesickness and humour: Ohio Row, Hardscrabble Lane, Camp Cozy, though cozy was rarely accurate. Drill continued through the season, the sound of marching boots muted by frost. Rifles grew cold to the touch. Breath rose in pale clouds as officers barked commands. The men learned to stack arms neatly, to cook over shared fires, to mend their own trousers with clumsy stitches. letters home became the anchor of their days. In the evenings, men gathered around barrels used as tables, dipping pen nibs into ink and writing by the glow of one shared candle. The paper crackled in the cold. Some letters were brave, others trembled with loneliness. All carried the weight of longing across the miles. The telegraph added its own voice to the season. At all hours, operators sat in warm shacks, tapping messages that clicked across the wires, a sound like beetles tapping slowly in the walls. Those clicks carried the pulse of an army, supply orders, weather reports, intelligence from scouts, and the cautious words exchanged between commanders in the capital. The war was no longer only men and horses. It was a machine made of rails, wires, gears, and code. Through the autumn, the war revealed more of its shape. In October came the sharp fight at Ball's Bluff in Virginia, where a failed crossing of the Potomac sent Union troops tumbling back against the riverbank and shocked Congress into launching a formal investigation. In November, Union naval forces captured Port Royal Sound on the South Carolina coast, seizing one of the Confederacy's most valuable deepwater harbors. That same month, General Ulysses S. Grant fought his first significant action at Belmont, a fierce, confused engagement along the Mississippi that hinted at the drive he would later be known for. And across the Atlantic, a diplomatic storm gathered when a U.S. warship stopped the British mail steamer Trent and seized 2 Confederate envoys on board, an incident that brought Britain and the Union dangerously close to war before December's end. In the South, winter brought its own hardships. Firewood grew scarce near the camps, uniforms wore thin, some men wrapped their feet in rags. Yet morale held for many. Victory at Bull Run had given them confidence, and the belief that they fought for their homes sustained them through the cold. On quiet nights, the pickets on both sides could sometimes hear each other across the dark, faint voices drifting over the fields. A laugh, a cough, a tune hummed to keep warm. The distance between enemies was often only a few hundred yards, close enough that one side might smell the other's campfire on the wind. By December, snow dusted the tents around Washington. The earth beneath the army's feet froze hard, and the sound of footsteps changed, sharper and more brittle. At dusk, campfires flickered beneath the trees, casting a warm glow on the canvas walls. Drums beat softly in the distance, muffled by the cold. The war had become something vast and mechanical, a great engine gathering strength, and both sides found themselves caught inside its turning gears. Yet on quiet nights a gentler rhythm prevailed. A soldier might sit on a wooden stool outside his hut, watching snow settle on the tent roofs like a thin layer of ash. He might hold a letter from home close to the lantern light, reading the words again and again. Or he might simply listen to the creak of frozen branches, to the soft cough of a horse in the picket line, to the far-off tapping of the telegraph along its wire. All of it woven together, carrying him toward a future neither he nor the nation could yet imagine. Winter had come, still and reflective. The armies rested but did not relax. Every man sensed that the year ahead would be different, harder, larger, and unforgettable. The war that had begun with a shout was settling into endurance, and beneath the snow, beneath the tents and fires and whispered letters, The ground waited for footsteps that would soon shake it in ways 1861 had only begun to suggest.